Hey, History Through Film. This is Miss Corey. Welcome to U2-L15 Jim Crow. Your job, you're going to watch this Ed puzzle, and any of the questions that are in blue text are going to be questions I want you to answer directly on the Ed puzzle. Learning goals. Students will be able to analyze complex and interacting factors within the long civil rights movement and identify obstacles to the success of the various civil rights movements, such as Black rights movement. So these standards are actually from the U.S. history standards. Heads up, today we will talk about racism in terms related to the suppression of Black Americans. Although some of these terms, people's events happened in the past, it is important that we learn about them today as to recognize the past and not make the same mistakes. If you have any questions or simply want to learn more, please let me know. I'm more than happy to help you out. So, what is Jim Crow? So, most of you have gone through US history. Some of you haven't yet, and that's no worries. So, a lot of you are 11th and 12th graders in this class. So, you probably had US history in 10th grade. There are a couple of 10th graders in this class. You're probably learning about some of the stuff right now. And then 9th graders, you probably learned about it in middle school at some point of time, but you'll learn about it next year. And you'll learn about it right now, to be honest. So, question for all of you: what do you know about Jim Crow laws? Or what do you know about the civil rights movement? And if you don't know anything, that's okay. Just say, I don't know. So there is a lot to talk about with the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement included not just like racial civil rights movement, but also different aspects of society as well. Today, we are going to focus primarily on the civil rights movement of Black Americans. So you might think of things such as marches. You might think of like the Little Rock Nine. That was a huge deal. You might think of Rosa Parks. She's the one who sat in the bus. You might think of Malcolm X or MLK. You could think of the NAACP, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You might think of the Black Panthers. You might think about racial segregation as well, where there were like separate water fountains and stuff like that. We'll also go into more detail. So, what is Jim Crow? So, Jim Crow started after the Civil War. So, the Civil War was between 1861 to 1865. So, in the South, right here would be like the Confederate States versus the North. And it really started in those southern states. So, lawmakers would legalize segregation in public places. So, for example, probably one of the most famous ones is where Black people could sit on buses or in trains, like you see here, or use the water fountain, what schools they could attend, and many more examples. These numerous laws would become known as the Jim Crow laws. So, Jim Crow was never like an official name, it was more of like a nickname that grouped all of these laws together. So you're probably like, okay, but why was it named Jim Crow? That's kind of like a weird name. Yeah, so Jim Crow came from the name of a fictional character that was created by white supremacists before the Civil War. That character had racial stereotypes of what white supremacists saw in Black Americans. So, Jim Crow laws would also ban Black people from voting, although they were legal citizens after the Civil War. And these laws were not only enforced by police, but they were also enforced by white supremacy groups, such as the KKK. So, are Jim Crow laws still around today? That is a really difficult question to answer. Not officially called Jim Crow laws, but yeah, there are some laws that are still biased today. So, laws like the Jim Crow laws officially became illegal after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Today, there is still stereotyping and discrimination across American society. One of the biggest examples of that would be the incarceration rates of people of color versus white people. Segregation. I've said this word a few times now, but what does it really mean? So, segregation is the act of keeping things apart. Racial segregation is keeping people of different races separated. So, here's an example of one. So, this was in Alabama in 1956. As you can see here, this is like an ice cream place. So white people could come up and order right here in the front of the shop. But colored people had to go around the corner and use the side window. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Other vocab. So you might see this word in a lot of historical documents and newspapers. Now, this word is a very tricky word. Is it a quote unquote bad word? Mm, it's an outdated word. Okay, so it really became outdated in the 1970s. Some older generations may still use it. Some Black seniors may still use it to describe their identity, such as on like the US Census. On the other hand, some people use this word in a negative connotation. The reason why I bring this up is because when we watch the documentary and some other the videos, you'll see some newspapers that use that word. So I just wanted to like talk about it so you know what it is at least. Another word would be Caucasian. So, Caucasian really has two different definitions. One is a racial definition and one is geographical. So, since we're not in geography class today, we're going to talk about the racial definition. So, it is an old term referring to someone who is of white ancestry. You also have Orion. So that was most notably used in World War II by Hitler and the Nazis. And that refers to Hitler's ideal person. So in his mind, the ideal person was white-skinned, blonde hair, blue eyes. And this term was used prior to World War II as well. But it is a fictional, again, fictional, meaning fake, superior race of humans. Eugenics. Now, this is also kind of a heavy topic. So, eugenics is the false belief that humans could be bred to be the perfect being. Okay? Again, this is a false belief. It started in the 1800s. It is deemed immoral and not scientifically proven today. So, scientists and governments ran, quote, methods such as involuntary sterilization, segregation, and social exclusion would rid society of individuals deemed by them to be unfit. So, again, today, this is seen as very immoral, and there is no scientific evidence to back this up. But in the 1800s, and as you can see here through the 30s, 40s, 50s, even probably until the 60s, this was a widely practiced belief. An example of eugenics in the United States would be the Tuskegee experiment. So this started in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, and the US government promised 600 Black men free medical care, but in return, they had to take part of this experiment. In this experiment, doctors would give the men syphilis. Like you can see right here in this picture, you can see that this man is getting a shot. The part that was really immoral is that these Black men didn't know they were getting syphilis. So this caused 128 men to die, and birth defects were passed down to their offsprings. And it took until 1997 for the US to finally apologize for what they did to these men and their families. There's also lynching. So I know we talk about this a lot in like US history, especially around like the Civil War and after Civil War period. But lynching is the public killing of someone who has not undergone the court system. So between 1882 and 1965, 4,743 people were lynched in the United States. 90% of them were Black people killed by white mobs. Now, when it comes to lynching, we usually think about like, oh yeah, that happened like Civil War in the South. But it actually happened even right here in the state of Minnesota. So, for example, here's a memorial in Duluth of 3 Black men who were lynched in 1920. Redlining. So, redlining is going to come up a lot in the Jim Crow the North video that we're going to watch. That is the practice of denying people access to a loan because of where they live. Even if that person is qualified for like a home loan, it will still be denied just because they live in one of these red zones. So here's a map of redlining. So this is of New Orleans, Louisiana. So you can see here, this is the giant map of the city. And what bankers and like real estate agents would do is they would lay out these maps and they would color in the areas that were seen or deemed undesirable to live in. So anyone in this red zone would automatically not qualify for a loan just because they live in a quote unquote undesirable area. So here's kind of an example I just kind of made up off the top of my head. So pretend we're in Minnesota, and it's in the 1950s, and a person making an average salary, which in the 1950s was $3,300, they walk into a bank. That person says, "Hey, I need a loan for a house. I want to buy in North Minneapolis." The banker says, no can do. We don't give loans to people who want to live in North Minneapolis because North Minneapolis was considered one of the red zones. And this was legal to do until 1968. There's also these things called racial covenants. And those were statements in property deeds. And that's where the owner had a sign that they were white and they would not sell property to any non white person. Now, this seems like something that would just happen in the South, right? We're like, oh, Minnesota, we're great with equality. Actually, this happened a lot in Minnesota, especially around like the 1900s all the way into the 1960s. So, for example, here's a property deed for Lake of the Isles, which is a very kind of like rich, uppity neighborhood in Minneapolis. So, right here, it says the party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Mongolian, Semitic, or African blood or descent. That's right. That was in the property deeds. Wow. That's crazy. You might also hear the word slums. So slums mean urban housing, and it has a high population density. They're typically poorly built and maintained houses, and they're typically associated with poverty. Now, one of the most famous places that have slums today would be like in Brazil. We also had the Harlem Renaissance. So that was from the 1910s until the 1930s, and it started in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. And that was really the growth of Black culture, art, music, and literature during a time where white suppression tried to snuff all that out. We have the NAACP, that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That was around in 1909, and they are still around today. They are a civil rights activist organization, and there's a lot to be said about them. And if you want to learn more, here's a link to their website if you are interested. So you might be sitting there watching this Ed puzzle, and you're like, Miss Corey, this is really good information, but why did we learn about this today? Really good question. So next is the movie Hidden Figures, and it is about Black female scientists in NASA. They had to not only fight for gender equality, but also racial equality. And most of you have learned about this kind of stuff in US history, especially you 11th and 12th graders. Ninth graders, maybe a little bit, 10th graders, you're probably learning about it right now. So that's why I wanted to go through it all with you. So we're all kind of like on the same page. We all have a little bit of understanding of what's happening in the US society at this time. So I talked through a lot of vocab today. So do you have any questions for me? And if you don't, that's okay. Just type none. All right, let's wrap this up. Today we learned about Jim Crow, segregation, Caucasian Orion eugenics, lynching, redlining, racial covenant, slums, Harlem Renaissance, and the NAACP. Next up, you're going to do U2-L16, Jim Crow of the North, 0 through 30. U2-L17, Jim Crow of the North, 30 through 57. Each of these videos are Edpuzzle videos. I will be grading on what questions you get right or wrong. And these videos are about how Minnesota racial segregation or housing was segregated. It's made by Twin Cities PBS, so that's our public broadcasting station. Typically, it's like Channel 2s for most of us. And of course, if you have questions or comments or simply want to learn more, please let me know. I am more than happy to help you out. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.